On your Tuesday episode of Locked On Raptors, Jakob Poeltl was an absolute revelation upon his arrival in Toronto at the trade deadline, but are there questions about his long-term fit with the Raptors as he hits unrestricted free agency this summer? We'll examine those questions and more as we start our player review series with Jakob Poeltl. Thanks so much for hanging.
You are Locked On Raptors, your daily Toronto Raptors podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, what's going on? Welcome to episode number 1383 of Locked On Raptors, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Sean Woodley. I've been covering the Toronto Raptors now for 9 seasons on various platforms. You can find all of my work over on Twitter at WoodleySean. You can subscribe to the podcast for free wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, all the different podcast apps. It's free. Subscribe so you never miss the next episode. You can follow the show on Instagram, Locked On Raptors, and you can join the Locked On Raptors Discord server. The link is in the description of this podcast. It's a ton of fun. Lots of just thoughtful, friendly, copacetic conversation about the Toronto Raptors. Not a thing you can find on the internet in very many corners these days. So come hang out. It's a lovely little place. We got Vivek Jacob in there dropping his takes. Lots of great folks. And throughout this player review series that we're kicking off today, I will be taking one Discord question per day about whichever player we're talking. I'll use that in the final segment of the show. So jump on into the Discord. It is in the description, and I look forward to seeing you in there. And with that, let's get to today's show. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. That's last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed with Gametime. All right, let's get to it. This is an annual rite of passage here on Locked On Raptors. The season ends, and as soon as that happens, we dig into individual player reviews. And I'm starting things off here with Jakob Poeltl, because I think Jakob Poeltl's presence informs a lot of what we're going to talk about with the other guys coming up as we dig into our player reviews here. And I think it's fitting to start with Yak because his arrival in the team was the most monumental shift that we've seen for this team in the last couple seasons. It completely, I don't want to say ended the Vision 6'9" of it all with the Raptors and their front office philosophy, but it certainly signaled a recognition from the front office that they had maybe erred in the way they built this team, kind of for one style of play and one style only. And my hope is that the arrival of Jakob Poeltl will ultimately lead to a more multiplicitous style of play from the Raptors. Big word. You got it from my toilet paper. We're going to dig in today to the stuff that was good with Yak on the team, the stuff that was not so good, the stuff that could be cause for concern long term, and we'll dig into the question of his future. Plus, we got that Discord question that we'll get to in the last segment as well. Let's start off, though, with what was good. And honestly, this is pretty simple. Simply acquiring Jakob Poeltl was good. The Raptors were a much better basketball team after getting Jakob Poeltl than they were before they had him. Full stop. End of story. The team made more sense. The Raptors starting five, which they had, kind of struggled to figure out over the course of the season. The small ball starters were okay, but not great, kind of barely scraping past even in terms of on-off differential. But when you bring in Jakob Poeltl, you create the starting five of Yak, Siakam, Scotty Barnes, OG Anunoby, and Fred VanVleet. That lineup was one of the best lineups in basketball after the trade deadline. And I think a real thing to build on if you're the Raptors going into next season. Lots went wrong this year. The arrival of Yak and the way that starting five really took off is certainly something that did not go wrong as much as it didn't bear fruit in the postseason. Just a little refresher on what Jakob Poeltl cost for the Raptors to acquire. It was a first-round pick in 2024, top 6 protected. You can quibble with how much you like or dislike giving away a pick next season. For me, I'm fine with the cost of acquisition, especially having seen what he did on the floor for the Raptors. Obviously, in a vacuum, it's different than the sort of context that the Raptors find themselves in. And I think in a vacuum, it's better looking than it is maybe just with where the Raptors are, considering they've traded out first-round picks. They've had talent drain, all that stuff. I understand if you are upset with the lack of a first-round pick next season. That said, all signs point towards next year's draft from all the experts suggesting that it's not a very good draft. The Raptors have a lottery pick this year. They'll get him into the system. That's great. This team also, I think, signaled that they don't want to tank or tear it down to the studs and build up around a 21-year-old Scotty Barnes and hope that it turns into something. They signaled that, no, we have some good players on this team. We think this is worth investing in here to see what we can build on here. And for me, I'm always going to prefer the keep good players and try to build from the middle, which is doable as much as there's this whole sort of don't be in the middle sort of, boogeyman that kind of lurks around every corner with every 40-something win team. There is a pathway to build from the middle. The Raptors have done it in the past, and I think that's what they've kind of signaled here is what they want to do, is they want to have internal growth. They want to ride Scotty Barnes' eventual ascendance into probably being the best player on the team in the next couple seasons. Hopefully, that would be great for the team. If not, things are troublesome. But to me, it feels like this is a signal that they're not going to tear this thing down to the studs no matter what. And so as far as first-round pick, Khem Birch, who was not doing much for the team anyway and had a pretty prohibitive contract, $6 million he was owed next year as well, so you get off that money. That's valuable. And then a couple second-round picks, and I just can't be moved to care about second-round picks. Yes, it's nice to have them, but also you can survive without them, and it's no problem. And they're basically just like pennies that you throw into trades now, apparently. They're just like the new currency that sweetens deals to make it palatable for both sides. I'm perfectly fine giving up a couple second-round picks. You're just as likely, I think, to find a decent player as an undrafted free agent as you are to find a good player with a 45th overall pick, or 43rd, I guess would be what the Raptors have this season, had they had their second rounder. Delano Banton was 46. David Johnson was 47. Outside of that sort of upper crust of the second round, I typically don't really care all that much about later second round picks. And you can find undrafted guys and get success out of that as well. And oftentimes there's incentive for undrafted guys to, in fact, become undrafted and not get picked in the second round because there's a little more agency that these guys have. Either way, second round picks, not this is about. We're talking about Jakob Poeltl. And Jakob Poeltl was really good when he was on the floor for the Raptors. 13 points, 9 boards, 2 assists, down an assist from where he was with the Spurs. Obviously, lots of guys have the ball in their hands on the Raptors, but I think there's maybe even more to milk out of Jakob Poeltl's playmaking next season if they can kind of get a little more of that elbow action rolling. I think there's also room for him to be a little more effective on the short roll. That's probably going to require the team to have a little bit more shooting around him, which we'll talk about in the next segment. But overall, Yak was really, really, really effective. He shot 57% from the line. There were moments where he looked all right. He had that, 7 of 7 games that the Raptors wasted from the line. That's always going to be a bit of a hang-up. But if you're above 55-ish%, you're pretty much in the clear of the hack-a-yak zone. And if you can stay out of that zone and you can actually be on the floor late in games and not have the whole flow of games disrupted because teams are just going to foul you. Happened a couple times this season, but not much. I remember Jokic had an intentional foul on Jakob Poeltl at one point in one of their games. But for the most part, he is, I think, overcoming the sort of free throw issues just by the tiniest of margins to make him viable out there. I think it's obvious, the Raptors were a better team with him. They were plus 13.4 points per 100 possessions in terms of the differential between when Yak was on the floor and when he was off. They were a plus 9 with him on the floor, minus 4-ish when he was off. And it's obvious, right? It's just such a clear indicator of how badly the Raptors needed center skills. Dudes who can do the things that centers have done on basketball floors in memoriam. Set screens, protect the rim, score around the basket. Jakob Poeltl brings all three of those things, baby, and a whole lot more. A little bit of passing, a little bit of, extra offensive juice with his, the little floater he's got and stuff like that. He was really, really effective. Again, part of it, I think, is probably he looks great because the guy who had been filling his spot before was nothing. They didn't have a center before, and so his arrival is so stark. It's such a drastic contrast from what the team looked like before he arrived, but you can't argue. He was really effective when he was on the floor for the Raptors. It was not just a center-colored glasses thing that we were getting excited about. This is a dude that knows what he does well. I think that's the best thing about Jakob Poeltl, right? He doesn't try to do too much outside of his wheelhouse. He knows he can pass from the elbows. He knows he can protect the rim. He knows he can have that little float shot that works for him, score around the bucket, crash the offensive glass. He's not taking stuff away by doing things that are not part of his wheelhouse. And I think that's a really important thing to have. 65.2 effective field goal percentage as a Raptor, just having that solid at the rim and around the rim scoring. The Raptors, I've talked about this. Their spacing is tough, and they badly need, I think, to really kind of spam the 2-point game, spam the rim scoring range, because they're not very good from 3-point range. It's just not what they have. They don't have the shooting on their roster, so they have to counteract that by being incredibly good at scoring 2-pointers efficiently, and I think Jakob Poeltl can get them on that path. He's been one of the most efficient scorers as far as big men go, field goal percentage, all that stuff, for years in the NBA, and that, I think, was a really nice addition. You have a dependably efficient player who's not going to take stuff away from you most nights. The other thing, too, is he made other guys better, right? Like, OG took off. OG Anunoby's best stretch of basketball as a professional came after Jakob Poeltl arrived. He really seemed to thrive with the opportunistic buckets that the passing of Yak created, that the roll gravity of Yak created, and I think that partnership is really, really nice, and it makes a ton of sense on paper, right? I also think we saw OG get emboldened to be a better defender with Jakob Poeltl, because Yak's back there to clean up the messes. OG could, be that 5%, 10% more aggressive in certain situations, jump that extra passing lane, knowing that Jakob Poeltl was there and not just like an absolute void of rim protection like there was in the first part of the season. So OG got better. Fred VanVleet played his best basketball of the season. Upon the arrival, his eyes just lit up at the idea of having a roll man to throw passes to, and to have an actual guy to set screens for him, hard screens that get contact, create space, get him going downhill. It was massive for Fred. Obviously, the 3-point shooting for Fred, not amazing, but I think that's kind of independent of his effect, or the effect that Jakob Poeltl had on him. And I think, for those who were concerned about Fred VanVleet's viability going forward, I think Jakob Poeltl seems to have, quelled some of the concerns. Obviously, he's not perfect. He gets blown by on defense, all that stuff, but you cannot look at what happened with Fred VanVleet after the Jakob Poeltl trade and say he got worse because Yak was there. He got, in fact, much better and more effective, and that was great to see. They had a core staple play they could run. Yak, Fred, pick and roll, and they got a lot of good stuff out of it, and I look forward to hopefully that being a partnership they can lean onto a little bit more next year. Even, I think, him and Scotty Barnes found some good chemistry. There was lots to like about Jakob Poeltl's arrival in the team. They played normal basketball. They looked like a real, just, hey, alien comes to Earth. You can show them their games, and it actually is a good representation of what normal basketball teams do, as opposed to the freak ball, the alien ball the Raptors were playing before the arrival of Jakob Poeltl. It wasn't all perfect, though, and we'll get into some of that in just a second here. In particular, it can be a little bit concerning to realize that the arrival of Jakob Poeltl maybe neutered the efficiency and the effectiveness of the Raptors' best player. I think that might be a little overstated, but we'll get to that in just a second, and what the effect of Jakob Poeltl was on Pascal Siakam and what that means going forward. Before we do that, gotta tell you about our friends over at Gametime. Buying tickets to your favorite event should not be stressful. Right now, it's the playoffs. Maybe you're on a whim wanting to go down to a big Game 7. Whether you're a hockey fan, whether you're a basketball fan, it's all there for you, available on Gametime. You can get those tickets right up to the last minute. You don't got to plan months in advance, weeks in advance, days in advance. You can do it the day of. Maybe you got a random off day because your boss gave you the afternoon off and you want to head into the Leafs game as they get ready for their series against Tampa tonight. Gametime's the place to do it. Forget all of the planning. Get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. With Gametime, they got deals on tickets right up to the day of the event, and you always get the best price with the Gametime guarantee, which means you find tickets in the same section and row for less. Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. That's a great deal. You can get images of your seat before you buy, so you know what to expect as well. You know the sight lines you're walking into. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, continuing on here with your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, we continue player review season all week long, and Monday, the beginning of the YouTube exclusive series, ranking every Raptor. the return, the reprise of my former Raptors HQ written column in video form. Very much looking forward to counting down all of the Toronto Raptors with you throughout the offseason. That comes Monday as we start off from the very bottom. Player number 269. We might do like a batch of players. I have yet to figure out the exact rollout schedule just yet. But ranking every Raptor, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you don't miss it. Please do that. It's much appreciated. Okay. Let's dive in now to the bad stuff with Jakob Poeltl. The stuff that was not so hot, the stuff that maybe leaves a little bit of concern going into the offseason. And I think number one is the Pascal Siakam adjustment phase that came in. All told, Pascal basically got back to his season-long numbers, or just shy scoring-wise, maybe just a smidge shy efficiency-wise as well. I didn't check after the last couple of games, but leading into the last couple of games, Pascal Siakam had basically returned to his usual form with Jakob Poeltl on the team. There was an adjustment period there, though, where it looked like Pascal did not know where his spots were, where he could go and attack. That got massaged out as time went along. Problem was, there's still a little bit of a concern to me with the spacing conundrum, right? And Vivek talked about this yesterday. The everyday listeners of the podcast will know. Big V talked about this yesterday in the podcast. He actually talked about it in the Discord a little bit more in expanded form. If you want to jump into the Discord, that's the sweet, sweet expanded analysis you're getting, baby. But look, the spacing of a Jakob Poeltl, Pascal Siakam, Scotty Barnes front court is going to be a concern. This was my biggest concern the day of the trade. It was the reason I gave the trade a C, tentatively waiting to see what happened in the offseason before making a full grade, but it was the reason before the Yak trade that I had kind of softened on the idea of Jakob Poeltl as a target for the Raptors, because Pascal and Scotty are probably going to be better suited if they can play next to a spacing big. This is why Miles Turner was the apple of mine and everybody else's in Toronto's eye, it seemed, going into the deadline before he signed that extension. You know, I still think that the idea of a shooting big man, if you gave the Raptors front office truth serum, they would say, you know what, I would like to have myself a shooting big man to pair with Pascal and Scotty. Jakob Poeltl is not that. He does other stuff to compensate for the fact he doesn't shoot, right? He can still space with his passing. He can work at the elbows, create laneways and passing lanes and driving lanes that way. But ultimately, the 3, 4, 5, if you're not getting much shooting out of those guys, you're going to be in tough offensively. There's cramped spacing. There's, I think they overcome it pretty well with just like excellent interior passing. But as we saw in the play-in game with the Bulls, if you can just collapse in down on that sort of trio of dudes trying to make havoc inside 18 feet, eventually there's just no space and passing lanes can crumble and you can get sort of duped into turnovers, which is exactly what happened and what led to the Raptors losing that game against the Bulls. And I think you could look at that and get a little worried about what the long-term ramifications of that front court could be. It's tough. Can you always close with Jakob Poeltl? I think is sort of the big overarching question that stems from this, right? And is it a problem if he can't close every game? I think you can probably overcome it just because he's not going to earn, we'll talk about this in the next segment, but he's not going to earn no-brainer 35-minute-a-night starter money. And if you actually have players who can slide in and assume different roles, I think Precious Achiuwa stands out as if he could be more refined and a little bit better and a little bit more consistent, he's your backup center for different situations in which it's not really Jakob Poeltl's time. It's not really his forte as far as the game style, the opponent, whatever. Gary Trent Jr. we saw close in place of Jakob Poeltl to provide shooting. They tried to do it in the Bulls game, but Gary Trent Jr. was just, in the midst of having one of his worst games as a professional basketball player. And so they had to go back to Yak. And, we saw the effects of that and the cramped spacing that we saw on offense in particular as a result. And so that is a question, right? Is it worth investing in a guy who you don't know for sure you can close every game with? And my sort of response to that is, look, you're never going to find a perfect fit in the NBA. There are 450 players in the league. There are 17 roster spots. And part of the puzzle of team building is making it work with the players you can get into the door, whether players you go and target or players who come through the door by the sheer luck and randomness of the NBA and the draft and how that just has so much bearing over what your franchise does. Just the players you're able to get in the door. You can't go and get every player in the door. It's just not how it works. And so can you work with imperfectly matching pieces? There are no teams in the NBA that are perfect. If you could build a perfect team, every team would be the 2017 and 18 Golden State Warriors. You just can't do that. There are going to be flaws you have to overcome with any roster. The Cleveland Cavaliers right now are dealing with two bigs who don't shoot and a wing who kind of stinks, and they are still in the playoffs and we're the 4th seed. Like, you can have success even with these sort of imperfections in your fit and your court geometry and all that stuff. And I do think that Pascal Siakam and Scotty Barnes stand a decent chance with the skills they have of being decent complements to Jakob Poeltl. But I think really where it comes in is, how do you respond when Yak can't be out there? Do you have other options you can go to? And I don't know if you can really lay it at the feet of Jakob Poeltl that the Raptors did not have those options this time around. Are we concerned about the closing question if, in fact, the Raptors have a 6th or 7th guy they can count on to assume that role? And is it, in fact, a strength to be had and to be sort of happy about, that you have different options for different games? This is the thing the Raptors have lacked the last couple seasons, is stylistic diversity. They just play one way, and that's the way they play. And it runs entirely counter to the exact model that won them a championship in 2019, where the whole thing about that team was, we can play with Kawhi, we can play without Kawhi. We can play with Marc Gasol as our sort of hub of offense. We can go with Serge Ibaka as our trigger man at the 5. We can play both of them together. We can play neither of them and go super small with Pascal at the 5, or whatever you want. Like, they had all of this optionality on that team. It was the reason they were able to navigate some really, really difficult and very different series on the road to winning the championship. And this Raptors team doesn't have that right now. Just because Jakob Poeltl can't close games every single time out, whether it's because his shooting is an issue, or the free throw problems, or just the way teams are defending, or the way maybe a spacing big is pulling Yak out away from the rim, which is another thing we can talk about. We'll actually get to sort of in our listener question from Discord. But, you know, this is still a thing to grapple with. It's ultimately, as much as I like Jakob Poeltl, as much as I think this is probably what they're going to try to do next season to see if they can make it work, there's something to be said about, like, maybe the front office panicked a little bit here. They couldn't do it sooner for reasons out of their control, probably. You know, the Spurs were asking for 2 first-round picks. I don't think you were doing that for a pending UFA, all of that. But they go and make this trade because it's just so obvious they badly need a center. Everyone in the league knows they need a center. So they go make this trade. They get Jakob Poeltl, and, you know, he's not one of the 7 or 8 really viable shooting big men who you can go and throw in your starting lineup in the league. So there's the imperfect fit there to deal with. And you give yourself just 26 games to sort it out, to test it out, see how it all works, while also adding a 3rd pending UFA to your mix when already the UFA question was kind of hanging over the season. And the Raptors front office put themselves in a really tough spot here. I don't think we can fully judge this trade until we see how they thread the needle this summer. But if it blows up, if Yak leaves, or they don't assemble a proper roster around Scotty and Pascal, or, you know, however you want to build it, if it doesn't look like a more sensible basketball team going into next season, and it's due to the difficult bind they put themselves into with their off-season maneuvering that they have to pull off, I think you could look back at this as being kind of a panicked trade, and the kind of trade that, you know, you'll look back on and just really, really regret for a long time. I don't necessarily think that's an outcome here that I would think is likely, but it is an outcome on the spectrum of outcomes, is that this gets looked back upon as a trade that put the Raptors into a bind, and they kind of had to settle for an imperfect fit. Again, it's not like you could just go and pluck any shooting big man from the world and throw him on the team. Serge Ibaka, unfortunately, is not 7 years younger than he is. If he were, he's probably the starting center on this team right now, or at least a very good backup to Jakob Poeltl, who gives you that optionality. But that's just not how it works. It's imperfect. You can't control when players are going to be available. And so I think they did about as good as they could do, considering the circumstances, to address the center. The other sort of side of this is, do you just leave it and don't touch the center position and just let the season waste away? I did not want to see that, because I think tanking stinks and not trying to win is nonsense. And the Raptors would have been actively not trying to win had they seen their biggest flaw and not addressed it at the deadline. And I ultimately just view the deal as sort of getting a head start in the offseason, which I think a lot of teams should probably do more at the trade deadline, is use it as a tool to sort of start your offseason plans in motion, get a head start on the rest of the league. But the fit issue is certainly going to be a thing that comes up, and it's not the last time we're going to talk about the Scottie, Pascal, Yak trio and whether it can work. That said, I think Siakam in particular feels like he could be on a track to being a pretty good three-point shooter. Yes, it's been up and down. He was like 33% this season. He had hot stretches, cold stretches. He had really great stretches after the Yak trade in terms of corner shooting, kind of fell off by the end of the season. But I think, he's got a mid-range bag now. He's got the stroke. I feel like he's as hard a worker as there is. And if Pascal Siakam comes back next season and is a 35, 36, 37% three-point shooter, things could look a lot easier, especially with Scottie Barnes maybe kind of taking a level up with the ball in his hands. If you can run Scottie Yak pick and roll, for example, which will require more shooting chops from Scottie for sure, but if you can run that, you can dot Siakam, OG, and Fred around them as sort of your spacing options. Let Siakam sprinkle in his own creation from time to time as well. Give him stretches with no Yak on the floor to improve the spacing he's working with. There's a way to make it work. That's on the coaching staff. That's on the front office to get creative in the way they piece this roster together. But it certainly is not a perfect situation, and there's a lot of blow-up potential if they don't manage and massage this fit correctly. We're going to come back on the other side, get into the off-season outlook for Yak. Will he be back on the team? Will he not? And what might he be back for in terms of a figure? We'll get to that in just one sec. Plus our Discord question of the day to close out the show. Before we do that, however, I must tell you about our dear friends over at PrizePicks, who've made daily fantasy sports super fun, super easy, and super accessible. All you got to do is download the PrizePicks app, and the world is your oyster for daily fantasy sports every single day in the sports world. Obviously, the basketball playoffs are going on right now. You got the NHL playoffs, you got MLB, you got the WNBA ramping up very soon here as well. Lots of sports for you to get into the daily fantasy sports fix. You can do cross-sport entries. All you're doing is picking from 2 to 6 players on an entry, and if they will go more or less than the projection for a given stat. So I was going to say Luka Doncic. He's not in the playoffs. Kevin Durant tonight against the Clippers, 25.5 points. More or less, you say more he gets over that, you are going to win that portion of your entry. If you get all 6 entries correct, or six picks on your... Excuse me, if you get all 6 picks on your entry correct, you can win up to 25 times your money. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy. Safe and fast withdrawals as well. Currently operational in over 30 states and in Canada in every province except for Ontario at the moment. Download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 from the promo code LOCKEDON. That means if you put in $100 of your own money, $100 of PrizePicks money will join your $100 in your account for you to play with. That is a great deal. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On at sign up for instant deposit match up to $100 with PrizePicks. All right, we continue on here, closing out your first listen of the day. Huge shout out as always to the everyday listeners of the podcast, and a reminder that Ranking Every Raptor is returning on Monday. I'm very excited to talk about Lamarck Baker and Garth Joseph and all your other favorites. Bruno Caboclo, we'll talk about him pretty early on as well. Not to mention all the very good players that we'll get into as we go along. Player interviews, hopefully with some of the folks on the list. Other chats with our Raptors internet pals, all that good stuff. Ranking Every Raptor, keep an eye out. Anyway, let's close this out. Jakob Poeltl and his future with the Toronto Raptors. It feels preordained that Jakob Poeltl is going to be back with Toronto. You don't give up a first-round pick if you don't intend to bring a guy back. Everything seems to suggest that Jakob Poeltl's happy here and wants to be here. It's hard to parse, obviously. You never know. These things can change. It's the NBA. Nothing is certain. But Jakob Poeltl, to me, seems like he's pretty all right in his station in Toronto. He's got his best bud, Pascal Siakam. Hopefully, they can kind of iron out the fit there and make it all work. But to me, it feels like he's going to be back. He might be the top priority, honestly. Like, yes, Fred VanVleet is a very important player to lock up too, unless there's an upgrade on his skills out there. Just don't see that really happening right now. But as far as locking in your anchor at center, it feels like it's going to happen with Jakob Poeltl. From everything out there, I've kind of rooted around some people who are in knowledge with the team. 17 to 20 million kind of sounds like the range he's going to land in. You might think that, he's going to have the Raptors over a barrel after the end of the season he had where he looked really good. I think maybe that's overstated. Like, I think there's a very real counter argument the Raptors can make where it's like, well, we tried to like not have you on the floor in the end of the play-in game, and your free throws are kind of a mess. Like, not that you want to go and denigrate a player, but this is what negotiations are going to entail. And I think there are, equal upsides and downsides to Jakob Poeltl that he can go and argue for whenever his agents are arguing for him to get paid. But everything sounds like 17 to 20 million a year is going to be what it is for Jakob Poeltl, and I think that's perfectly fine. Yes, there's the downside to paying him if the fit doesn't work out, and is it ideal to sort of anchor your team around a center who doesn't exactly fit with the two guys who you figure are going to be your best players going forward right now? I think it's probably a year away. You get Yak locked up now, and then you get next year to kind of see, all right, can they work this fit a little bit better? Does Pascal come back a refreshed three-point shooter? Does Scotty Barnes come back a 33 or 34% three-point shooter around that sort of area where three-point shots become super-duper efficient and the shots you want to go for? 33% is kind of the area you want to be. Can you get Scotty Barnes to that range? And without knowledge of whether you can do that, I think it would be pretty foolish to go and blow up that trio before we really have more data on it. It's 26 games that we have in the books right now, and I think you got to see what does it look like over the course of a full season. How are they able to adapt and massage their game plan, their offensive stylings to work around their limitations, and how do you layer in potentially an expanded three-point package from Pascal or Scotty? I think Pascal is far more likely to have an uptick next season. He's had three-point shooting seasons of success in his past, all of that. Again, the mid-range game is there. I think there's a pathway here, but certainly there's a downside if it doesn't all come together. And a year from now, you might be looking at having to blow up that trio. That's certainly on the table here as a thing that could happen. But ultimately, do I think he's going to be back? Yes, I do. The fit's imperfect. It might require a shakeup down the line, but Yak is good. He's going to cost you like a crazy amount of money. 17 to 20 million bucks is a perfectly reasonable amount of money to pay into him. And frankly, to acquire him for a first round pick and not re-sign him, that would be some piss poor asset management that you could absolutely roast the Raptors front office for if that does go down. That would be an absolute disaster, no doubt about it. But I think he'll be back, and I'm pretty happy and excited to see if they can massage that fit. Because guess what? Jakob Poeltl, for all his foibles and sort of that's not even his foibles, it's just the things that are realities within the construct of this team. Even with all of that, he made the Raptors better. He made them the sixth best defense after the trade deadline. The offense took its time, and that was always my biggest concern. But I think there's a pretty good baseline here of something to build upon with that trio as your front court going forward. Let's get to the question here to close it out from Jay Rich in the Discord. Welcome to the Discord, Jay Rich, regular question asker of the podcast on mailbags and all that. But if you want your questions read as we go through these player reviews, drop a question into the Discord server, and I will pick one each day to answer. And this one is, does Jakob Poeltl have the lateral... sorry, let me just get this brought up on the screen. Does Yak have the lateral footwork to fit into what the Vision 6-9 model of this team was aiming to achieve, or... would they have to employ two separate schemes when he's on and off the court? Can they use both next season potentially? And here's where I come down on this. The Raptors should be playing more than one style of defense. They should be testing out different things. Ultimately, though, I think the Raptors are going to have to take a long, hard look in the mirror. They might not have to. Maybe Nick Nurse is gone and some new philosophy comes in that wants a more sort of stable drop-style defense with Yak as the anchor, and maybe that solves this problem. But, I think Yak showed he can kind of hang out a little bit as far as, bringing his feet up to the level of the screen and still tracking back and staying in front of guys relatively well. It's not his biggest strength by any means, but he can do it in a pinch. He's got good footwork, all of that. Ultimately, though, I do think if you're going to have Jakob Poeltl on your team, if you're going to invest in him being your center, do the thing he does best. He's best as a drop big. Amplify the strengths of your players. That is something the Raptors did not do this season, I think, nearly enough. And that's something that, is going to require, if Nick Nurse is back, changing up the philosophy a little bit, I think. If it's not Nick Nurse, maybe someone comes in and just realizes, 7'1" big man who's good as a drop big. I guess we should probably have him be a drop big and play drop most of the time. That's very possible as well, that some head coach comes in and has that winning idea of playing the big rim protecting man near the rim where he can rim protect. But yeah, ultimately, I'm not opposed to multiple styles of playing defense. I think the Raptors got far too stuck in on the way they play defense this season. It's not just about Yak, it's about everybody. It's about the tax that it is on all these guys' bodies to play that aggressive defense all season long. It's hard to uphold for 82 games, not to mention the mistakes that inherently come from playing a high-risk style of defense. Those mistakes pile up. They can be the margins between winning and losing. As much as Yak is great, he can't clean up everything. There are still going to be messes that seep through and end up in the bottom of the bucket. And I think, in general, if Yak is on the team, there's got to be a little bit more of a conservative approach to the defense. And they should be able to do that as well, because they have OG, one of the best wing defenders alive. Shout out to him. I think he finished 8th or 7th in all defense voting. Defensive player of the year voting. Awesome for OG. We'll see about all defense soon. But you have OG, incredible on-ball defender. You have Pascal, who can slide his feet and stay in front of most guys as well. His defensive ability waxed and waned this year, I think, a little bit, but when he really needs to ratchet it up, he can ratchet it up. He was the best guy they had for Zach LaVine, for example, in that play-in game. The whole defense has a chance here to get better with conservatism and just trusting the guys on the team to be good defenders. And with Yak there to clean things up at the back, you can sprinkle in some more aggressive stuff, blitz the odd time, all that stuff. But the core defense, I think, should amplify the most important defensive player on the team. And as great as OG is, the rim protecting center is your most important player, and you have to adapt your defense to that player. It's what the Bucks have done with Brook Lopez, but even this year, yes, Lopez is primarily a drop big, but they've worked him a little bit more this season as a guy who can stretch out to the level of the screen, who can switch on to guys. That stuff you then layer in on top of the very good baseline that you've set for yourself. I think that's kind of where the Raptors have to go here and sort of reconstruct this defense from the ground up with Jakob Poeltl's best skills and strengths in mind. The dude can protect the hell out of the rim. Give him a shot to do it. Don't put yourself in a position where you're having him pulled out to the basket by your own accord. There will be times where he does get pulled away by shooting bigs. That's part of the deal. But you don't need to go and invite that when you don't have to, I guess is the way I would put it. Either way, thanks for the question, Jay Rich. Thanks to everyone who sent in questions about Yak. If I didn't get to them in the episode, I'll probably get you in the Discord with a quick reply at some point today as well. But get in the Discord, baby. Get those questions in for our future player reviews. Tomorrow, we are going to take a look at one OG Anunoby, building off of the strength of his high finish in the Defensive Player of the Year voting. I'm hoping Katie Heindel was along for that. But either way, thank you so much for tuning in to the show, making us your first listen every day. Shout out to the everydayers out there. If you are an everyday listener of the show, let us know in the comments. It's always nice to get that little nudge as well from those who are, for some reason, deciding that I am a voice and face you need to see and hear every day. And I thank you so much for that bizarre decision that you have made. You're the best. You're my best friends in the whole wide world. See, this parasocial relationship goes two ways, baby. Anyway, we'll wrap it there. Thank you very, very much. And go and check out Locked On Leafs today. Crossover episode time with Locked On Lightning as they preview Game 1, Leafs and Lightning tonight in Toronto. I'm not going to throw up. You're going to throw up. With that, we will talk to you again on Wednesday. And reminder, follow, subscribe to, rate, review, all the good stuff on all the different channels, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. And thank you so much for hanging. Bye-bye.